Well, the title of this session is Recognition, Desire, and Mastery. Maybe a zestier topic than how Deixis presupposes anaphora, or even the way in which laws go beyond super facts. I'm going to talk about the self-consciousness chapter, chapter 4 of the Phenomenology. I'm not going to talk about the whole thing, just the introductory material and the first half, part A, which is titled Independence and Dependence of Self-Consciousness, Lordship and Bondage. I'm not going to talk about part B on the freedom of self-consciousness, Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. I do in the book, in the last part of chapter 10, because it's important to my overall project to see that the problem that he finds in Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness is that they can't normatively support determinate conceptual contents, given how they understand themselves. And I view this as an important confirmation of my semantic reading of Hegel's book. But there just isn't going to be time to talk about it, talk about that sort of consequence of the meat of the chapter today, so much being so little time. Note that it's always been an architectonic embarrassment that while the consciousness chapters, the reason chapter, and the spirit chapters all have three parts, even though the consciousness, the three parts are divided into three chapters, where in the other large sections of the book, they're just subsections of one chapter. Still, the self-consciousness chapter only has two parts, A and B, though both of those subparts have three parts. I think roughly the second part is a follow-up of what happens in the first half. In A Spirit of Trust, I talk about the self-consciousness chapter in three chapters. Chapter 8 on the transition from organic desire to social normativity. Chapter 9's on the simultaneous institution of self-conscious individual normative selves or subjects and their communities by reciprocal recognition. And chapter 10 is on the deformed selves and communities that are instituted by asymmetric recognitive attitudes, what Hegel explores under the heading of mastery or lordship and bondage. And though there is a logic to this progression, today I thought it was worth pursuing a somewhat different order. The heart of Hegel's philosophical contribution here, I think, is his account of how normative statuses are instituted by social normative attitudes, specifically what he calls recognitive attitudes. So that's where I'm going to start. And then I'll look back at how individual normative self-consciousnesses and their communities might have emerged from the organic soup of merely desiring organisms. And then after that, I'll look at how the original form in which recognitive practices first emerge is, Hegel claims, inevitably a defective, asymmetric one, instituting the normative structure of subordination and obedience, in which non-normative power relations are given a normative shape, but which this undistorted normativity hasn't disentangled the power relations from the properly recognitive relations. That's the deformed conception of normativity and form of normativity that understands it in terms of categories, that is, meta-concepts, that Hegel calls pure independence or mastery. I'm going to understand pure independence as authority without correlative responsibility. But first, I think it's worth mentioning, at least briefly, how I'm reading this text in the sense of the methods that I'm using. Because there's three quite distinct reading strategies that I'm going to talk about. Two models, and then a reading of Hegel's meta-concept of pure independence. And their status and function is quite different. And so, there isn't some one way I'm reading this chapter. And I think thinking about these two models and this other strategy at the beginning begins to show the sort of range of hermeneutic approaches that I'm employing here to try and convey the philosophical significance of Hegel's view. So one model is a mapping of Hegel's vocabulary onto the vocabulary I'm going to use. It follows his vocabulary in detail, but translates it. And in doing so, points to features of his text that others have really not noticed. Specifically, the way the in itself for consciousness distinction gets used specifically differently, but with an intelligible common generic structure, first on the side of consciousness, the empirical cognition of objective reality, and then on the side of self-consciousness, the normative side of the subject. So that's where I'm going to start in just a minute. The second model is the triadic or rectic model of proto-consciousness. This is the explanation of Hegel's gnomic and enigmatic claim at the beginning of this chapter that self-consciousness is desire. The model I use operates at a considerable distance from the text, but I think nonetheless that it illuminates what goes on there. And the third is an application of the terminology in the first model to understanding the discussion of mastery in stages. So here, the first stage is what Hegel calls the struggle unto death between individuals whose conception of themselves is as sovereign desirers, as being such that what things are in themselves is just whatever they are for them. And then second, the genuine self-constitutive achievement of the victor of that struggle unto death. We know that's the master, but I think people have not realized the genuine achievement that the master has made in moving us from the merely biological realm of nature to the genuinely normative realm. And I think they haven't understood exactly the rationale, sort of what the master gets right about his accomplishment, as well as what he doesn't see, the irony of his situation. And then I want to lay out the asymmetric master-slave normative structure of subordination and obedience that gets instituted by these asymmetric recognitive relations. And finally, and so talk about why it is the master can never be who he thinks he is, never get what he wants. And finally, the chapter closes with the implicit triumph of the slave through concrete labor. That's where I think we see the transition to the next chapter, Reason, which is the discussion of intentional agency. The slogan there is, reason is purposive agency. That's what he says in paragraph 24 in the preface. So first, I want to talk about the conceptual model and translation of Hegel's vocabulary that I'm going to be articulating. This is looking generally at normative statuses and attitudes. And the first application we'll look at is the development from Kantian autonomy to Hegelian reciprocal recognition as ways of thinking about the nature of discursive normativity. This model, this translation, structures my whole discussion. The discussion of normativity here in self-consciousness, the discussion of intentional agency and reason, and then the ages of Geist, the traditional structure of normativity, its modern alienated successor, and the postulated third postmodern stage. And it starts with the distinction between normative attitudes and normative statuses. And the way I'm using normative statuses, we could just talk about norms. It articulates my normative reading of Hegel, which follows, in my story, understanding Kant's discovery of the normative character of discursiveness in general as the axis around which all of his thought revolves. And it's this idea that the significance, the philosophical significance of German idealism was principally to make discursive normativity, to bring that to the center of the philosophical stage. And this underlies the connections that I see between German idealism and later American pragmatism, and pragmatism generally in the broader Rortian sense that sees pragmatism as central to the thought both of the later Wittgenstein and of the early Heidegger. So we can start with Hegel's talk of what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. This is a distinction that applies both on the side of empirical cognition. We're introduced to the distinction already in the introduction, but it also applies on the side of subjects themselves. And that's where we are now, is thinking about the distinction between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness, when the things we're talking about are knowing and acting subjects instead of the objects we know about and act on. So let me, this should be available on your handout. We're talking about the pragmatics, the theory of normativity. So on the side of subjects, we've been looking at the semantic side in consciousness before. We're moving over to the side of the subjects, to the pragmatics rather than to the semantics. And here you'll see the distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes. That's my translation, that's my model. But what it's translating is his talk about what consciousness is in itself. That's the norms that really govern, that really articulate it. And what consciousness is for consciousness, that's a matter of normative attitudes, what we take those norms to be. This translation is meant to track Hegel's vocabulary very carefully, closely. And it involves two subdivisions. On the side of normative statuses, well, on the side for Hegel of what consciousness is in itself, he talks about, in the title, for instance, of the first half, part A of the chapter, about consciousness's independence and dependence. And here, the translation I propose is that we think of those two fundamental normative statuses as authority and responsibility. Now, the notions of independence and dependence have uses for Hegel on the semantic side, on the cognitive side, on thinking about our relationship to objects of knowledge as well. And I think people have not, I think readers of Hegel have not worried enough about the relation between the discussion of independence and dependence on the side of our relation to objects and the use of independence and dependence here. I think this goes back to Kant's distinction of two flavors of necessity, theoretical necessity and practical necessity. The theoretical necessity that we find in laws of nature and the practical necessity we find in moral laws. And him seeing those, Kant seeing those as two species of necessity, Notwendigkeit, I see as a reflection of his deep insight into the unity of Hume's skepticism. Kant saw that the same thing was at work in Hume's epistemological skepticism about the way in which the necessity of laws of nature goes beyond actual statements of fact, on the one hand, and the way in which Hume saw ought outrunning and being irreducible to is, on the other. I think Kant saw these are actually two sides of one coin in a way that Hume himself never articulated. And Kant's notion of necessity is introduced to acknowledge that duality. This is the distinction between alethic and deontic modalities that I introduced under the heading of bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. But on the side of statuses, we see this in the distinction between authority and responsibility. And everything I'm going to say today is a working out of that reading of independence and dependence on the side of subjects. Now, I put in the website a link to the missing chapter from A Spirit of Trust, which is a reading of early modern discussions of normativity that tracks, in a way, Jerry Schneewin's discussion of the antecedents of Kant's notion of autonomy, but uses this distinction of normative attitudes and statuses, tracking the distinction between what people are, what we are in ourselves, and what we are for ourselves. Understanding the earlier philosophers' discussions of normativity, Pufendorf, the British moralists, and so on, in terms of the lessons that I take Hegel to have learned from them about the relations between normative statuses and normative attitudes in particular. Early readers of the manuscript, in particular John McDowell, said, no, this is not pulling its weight in the manuscript. It doesn't correspond to any particular part of Hegel's text, and they persuaded me that this was needlessly making the book long, though it's near and dear to my heart. But the point of it is to see how Hegel might read the distinctions that he's using in these earlier philosophers that he discusses. This understanding of independence and dependence in terms of authority and responsibility is going to guide my reading of the Lordship and Bondage section, because in particular, I understand the conception the master has of himself as purely independent. Pure independence is Hegel's phrase, as in terms of seeing authority without correlative responsibility. And that's a conceptual innovation. Other people who read the Lordship and Bondage section don't read it that way. I think they're missing. I think they're missing something. On the other side of attitudes, Hegel talks about what a consciousness is for another consciousness and what a consciousness is for itself. Now here, one of the important things is, I think, is that in the epistemological discussions, Hegel never talks about a consciousness. He just talks about what things are for consciousness or in themselves. But here, where that same distinction is applied on the side of subjects, he does talk about a consciousness and another consciousness. That is, what a consciousness is for, what a consciousness is for another consciousness. That's a matter of what authority and responsibility one consciousness attributes to another. What do I take you to be authoritative about? What do I take you to be responsible for? As opposed to what your statuses actually are, what authority you really have, what responsibilities you really have. And what a consciousness is for itself is a matter of the authority it claims for itself, but maybe doesn't really have, or what responsibilities it acknowledges, again, which it may be at some distance from the responsibilities that it really has. So this is the overall translation that I claim will help us understand Hegel's ferocious vocabulary. And really the two interpretive pillars of my reading are the semantic focus on conditions of determinateness of conceptual content that includes the metalinguistic reading of categorical concepts and the method that I called semantic descent of understanding what's the nature of those meta concepts in terms of what they let us say about the use of ground level concepts. On the one hand, that's the framework we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. And on the other, the normative pragmatic meta vocabulary of status and attitude with its attendant subdivisions here on the side of statuses and on the side of attitudes. So from here on out, the second aspect of the reading is going to be to the fore. I see Hegel as having an intricately articulated metaphysics of normativity. And these are the terms I'm going to be articulating it in. And in particular, it's in these terms that I want to understand his recognitive theory of self-consciousness as a social product. He sees self-consciousness as itself a social status, and of the normative selves and their communities as synthesized by practical attitudes of reciprocal recognition, as his account of how we can understand normative statuses in terms of normative attitudes, while in the end leaving room for statuses still to transcend the attitudes that institute them. So far we've been looking at the semantic side. From here on out, we're going to look at the normative, pragmatic side. Okay, let me pause there for questions or comments. Oh, yes, Katja.
When we're looking at this presentation, consciousness is in itself. It's without the particle. This is meant that the status is some general thing. It's a kind of essence or such. And when we're looking at the attitudes, you inferred the what a consciousness is for another consciousness. This is then you are talking about particular consciousnesses. This is the social side, and this is intended like this.
Okay, I mean, I am thinking of what a consciousness is in itself as a matter of what it's really responsible for and what sort of authority it really has. And that varies from one consciousness to another. The whole story is about, consciousness, well, self-consciousness now in general, but it's a consequence of the social aspect of his theory, that to understand what self-consciousness is, full stop, we have to understand these social relations. We have to understand what some consciousness is for another consciousness, and what it is for itself, and how those, what it is for another consciousness, what it is for itself, and what it is in itself all interact.
Yeah, and can I just ask another question? And the status is a social. This is a social status, and do you think that Hegel intended it like that? What consciousness is in itself is a social status, or is would it be more than a social status?
No, I think it's social statuses all the way down. I mean, I mentioned on the epistemological side the Hegelian slogan that I take Hegel to claim in Kantian terms that all transcendental constitution is social institution. And here we can see that applied to self-consciousness. He thinks to be a normative subject is to be self-conscious, and that consists in being recognized as having a certain kind of authority by those one recognizes. And remarkably, that is a social achievement. It's a radically non-Cartesian theory of self-consciousness as something that doesn't happen between the ears of the self-conscious subject, but between the members of a community. It's a matter of their status in the community. He understands it in normative terms. It's having a certain kind of authority, a certain kind of responsibility, and those are social facts about you, that you have those statuses. So he sees my self-consciousness as essentially involving all of you. And this is what I mean it as a radically non-Cartesian theory of self-consciousness. And it's because I think this is so important. I mean, I think it's at the core of what Hegel has to teach us, but I think it's philosophically a good idea, worth exploring in its own right. And it underlines the extent to which, at any rate, one traditional, perhaps dominant strand of Hegel interpretations that read Geist as a super subject that is self-conscious in a Cartesian sense, are exactly missing the point that he's making here. Yeah. So, oh, please.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question. So, I was curious whether this essential constitution, the social constitution, is that, to use your earlier distinction, a sense-dependent one or a reference-dependent one? Because it seems to me that sense dependence is more possible.
It's both. He thinks that self-conscious individual normative subjects and their communities are simultaneously synthesized by reciprocal recognition. That is, when their attitudes towards each other, their specifically recognitive attitudes towards each other, have the right structure, that they actually bring into existence something that wasn't there before. This is how we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, not individually. I'm pulling your bootstraps and you're pulling mine, but how we raise ourselves out of the merely organic soup and make ourselves into something new, into normative subjects. So it's a good question, but he means the very strong claim that this is reference dependent as well as sense dependent. So here, I think a good way of thinking about this is against the Kantian background. Kant had what Hegel takes to be a decisive advance over traditional conceptions of normativity in terms of subordination and obedience, whose origins we'll see in the discussion of lordship and bondage, by thinking in terms of autonomy and put in the language of status and attitude and of authority and responsibility. Kant's conception was of normative subjects as autonomous. That's a conception of them as able to bind themselves normatively, institute normative statuses, make themselves responsible by taking themselves to be responsible. That is, they could institute a normative status by adopting a normative attitude. And what I think of as the basic Kantian normative status, autonomy, is a complex status that essentially involves attitudes. Okay, so here, remember how these diagrams work? The polygons are statuses and the ovals are attitudes. The Kantian autonomous subject has the authority to constitutively institute responsibilities simply by acknowledging them. You are genuinely bound by what you acknowledge yourself as bound by what you take yourself to be bound by. So It's the idea of you're having attitudes that are constitutive of your statuses. This is downstream from Rousseau's ringing slogan. The reason that the only decoration in Kant's workroom was a portrait of Rousseau over his writing desk is because Rousseau said, obedience to a law one is laid down for oneself is freedom. And that's to say that it's the authority to bind yourself by norms, to commit yourself and make yourself responsible. That's the basic Kantian insight. Now, that's an individualistic model, but there is a social dimension to the Kantian picture as well. Here, you've got the key to the diagram on the left, and the one we were just looking at is on the right. But Kant thinks that other autonomous beings owe a duty of respect to autonomous beings, that they need to acknowledge their authority to bind themselves. That is, they have a responsibility to respect, a responsibility to attribute that authority, the authority to bind oneself, to other subjects. Now, suppose you accept, and now let me say, the fact that the distinction between statuses and attitudes, the distinction between authority and responsibility on the side of statuses and of attribution to another or acknowledgement oneself on the side of attitudes, lets us decompose and analyze Kant's picture already in these terms. I think is showing the expressive power and flexibility of what I claim is Hegel's conceptual scheme here. I'm just making it, more processable by us by translating it into these other terms. But suppose you accept the motivations that lead Kant both to his conception of autonomy, of the basic complex of basic attitudes and statuses that is this socially extended basic Kantian normative status. But suppose you also thought that all normative statuses, and not just some of them, are instituted by normative attitudes. And that such institution requires not only the attitude of the subject of the status, but also the attitude of some other who attributes it. You see, Kant has at the top of these pictures of the subjects authority and responsibility that don't derive from anybody's attitudes. Autonomous subjects, what they are is beings that come with a certain kind of authority. It's an authority, it's the authority to have self-constitutive attitudes, attitudes that can institute further statuses. And as autonomous, they also just come with the responsibility to respect that autonomy, that is, to attribute that authority to those who have it. The responsibilities at the bottom, the commitments that a Kantian being undertakes by acknowledging them, by undertaking those commitments, those are instituted by attitudes. That's the Rousseauian point. But the authority, the statuses that are autonomy, the kind of authority that is autonomy, the authority to bind oneself, to commit oneself, and the responsibility to attribute that authority, that is to respect others' autonomy, those are just there. Suppose you thought that this was right as far as it goes, but that all normative statuses were instituted by attitudes, and that that wasn't something we could do, each of us on our own, but that it took a village. It took more subjects to do that. Well, then you might come with a picture, which is the reciprocal recognition picture, in which each of us has a kind of authority, the authority to attribute authority to others. That's recognizing somebody. Recognizing somebody is taking them to be a normative subject in something very like the Kantian sense, that is taking them to have the authority to bind themselves, but we take them to have that authority only insofar as it's attributed to them. Attributed to them by whom? Well, by the people they have acknowledged the authority to hold them responsible. I'm going to say some more about that in a minute. Let me just rehearse the passages that are getting interpreted here. Self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself, and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged, recognized, same word, anerkannt. The detailed exposition of the notion, the Begriff, of the spiritual unity and its duplication will present us with the process of recognition, Anerkennung. Again, a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it in fact self-consciousness. It's only in being acknowledged and being recognized that it is a self-consciousness. For only in this way does the unity of itself in its otherness become explicit for it, become something for it. It can only recognize itself insofar as it's recognized by others. The I, which is the object of its Begriff, is in fact not object. The object of desire, well, we'll talk about why that's in there later on, is only independent, authoritative, for it's the universal indestructible substance, the fluid self-identical essence. All right, I'm not going to say anything about that right now. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. It's an object for another who recognizes it, but to recognize someone is to take them to be an I, to attribute the authority to bind themselves to them. What still lies ahead for consciousness, now he's talking about in the order of exposition in the book, is the experience of what Geist is. This absolute substance, his word for a community here, which is the unity of different independent, authoritative self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence. The I that is we and the we that is I. That's what we ultimately have to understand. And I'll just point out, this 177 here, that's the very last paragraph, the very last sentence of the introduction before we start part A, the first half. But according to the notion, the Begriff of recognition, this, that is self-consciousness, certainty of itself, have truth, is possible only when each is for the other what the other is for it. Only when each in its own self, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of being for self. And again, each is for the other the middle term, through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself. And each is for itself and for the other, an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. This is gegenseitig Anerkennung. Mutual reciprocal recognition. Thus, the movement is simply the double movement of the two self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as it does, recognize. Each does itself what it demands of the other, recognizes, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. Action by one side only would be useless because what is to happen can only be brought about by both. It's only when they recognize each other. It's only when I'm recognized by those I recognize. It's only when those I've authorized to hold me responsible actually hold me responsible for what I take myself to be responsible for, that I genuinely am responsible for it. I can't make myself responsible all on my own. This is the I that is we and the we that is I. So the idea is that you become a self in the sense of a normative subject, the subject of normative statuses, one who is bound by norms in the sense of being properly subject to normative assessment as to the correctness of your exercises of authority and your acknowledgement of responsibility. You become a normative self or subject in that sense only by being recognized as such by those you recognize as such. That crucial normative status, being a normative self or subject, is fundamentally a kind of social status. Now, remember the sort of examples that I mentioned when I first talked about this, I think in the second class. This is the sense in which to have the status of a good writer or a good philosopher consists, he's saying, in being taken as such by those you take to be such. It's not the recognition of just anybody who's scribbling. It's the people you think are good writers whose recognition would be constitutive of your being a good writer or a good philosopher, this normative status. That's not something that your opinion of yourself all by itself, that's not a status it can institute. You can be that for yourself. You can aspire to that. But to actually achieve it, you have to be recognized as having that status by the people that you've authorized to settle whether or not you have that status, whose authority you've recognized. And it's only that reciprocal recognition that actually institutes a normative status. This is the sense in which being a normative self or subject, even for yourself, self-consciously, is a kind of social status. In this sense, there aren't any selves that aren't self-conscious selves. The consciousness of yourself as a self is your practical attitude of recognizing and being recognized as a self. It's not just your attitudes, it's everybody's attitudes. And self-recognition, recognizing yourself as a self, is the product of being recognized as such by those you recognize, that's what makes it a status. You've achieved the status of self-consciousness, not just an attitude. Now, here I think it's worth thinking about this in lightly algebraic terms. He's saying that recognition is reflexive. So something's reflective if X R X stands in the relation R to itself. He's saying that happens for recognition only as a consequence of reciprocal recognition. So a symmetric relation, XRY and YRX. You recognize others and they recognize you. That's the symmetry of the recognitive relation. And what would it take for that symmetry to induce reflexivity? Well, if it were transitive, if XRY and YRX and YRZ entailed XRZ, if you were, by the nature of recognition, obliged to recognize anybody who was recognized by somebody you recognized, then if de facto you achieved symmetric recognition, reciprocal recognition, if you were actually recognized by those you recognize, that would institute self-recognition. That is, genuine normative status requires recognition to be an equivalence relation, to be transitive, symmetric, and therefore reflexive. Fancifully, the modal logic of Hegelian recognition is S5. If an accessibility relation is an equivalence relation, reflexive, symmetric, and transitive, the modal logic is S5. That's his picture of a genuine recognitive community and of undefective normative statuses. That's what I've been saying is a radically non-Cartesian sense of self-consciousness. The self-consciousness doesn't happen between your ears because it's a normative status, and normative statuses are always and everywhere social statuses for Hegel. Communities, in the ideal case where recognition is reciprocal, are synthesized out of these recognitive dyads. But because recognition is de jure transitive, that creates an equivalence relation of a community of people, all of whom recognize each other and are recognized by each other. Now, one of the arguments I pursue laboriously, I'll admit, in the book, is an argument that, given the way he's thinking about recognition, it has to be transitive. That I'm obliged to recognize anybody who's recognized by anyone I recognize. In recognizing somebody, I'm attributing them the authority to constitutively recognize somebody, at least anybody who recognizes them. And I'm not going to rehearse that argument here. Again, that's not tracking any particular bit of Hegel's text. But the idea is that normative selves or subjects and their communities are simultaneously synthesized by reciprocal recognition, brought into existence when their practical attitudes towards each other have the right social structure. This reciprocal structure. That's the I that is we and the we that is I from that passage I quoted. And the next thing I want to say about this is I take this constellation of attitudes and statuses to be absolutely at the heart, not just of Hegel's theory of normativity, but of his logic and metaphysics. So if you look at his logic, the most striking thing about it is that where the tradition he inherited, what had been made of scholastic logic roughly after the Port Royal logic, was in terms of particulars and universals, thinking of classificatory relations, something particular falling under something universal, or one universal subsuming another, classifying judgments in terms of the kind of classification of particulars and universals they had, and then classifying syllogisms in terms of the kinds of classifications, their judgments involved. Hegel adds the notion of an individual. He says that there's really, besides particulars and universals, there's individuals. Individuals are particulars as characterized by universals. And he uses this notion to advance from thinking about particulars and universals through the notion of individuals, particulars as characterized by universals, to the notion of judgment, and finds the truth of these particulars, individuals, and universals to be in judgment, and the truth of judgments then to be in inferences. So the striking thing about a striking feature of his logic, if you look at it against the background of the logic he inherits, is that besides particularity and universality, he has individuality. Or singularity, it's Besonderheit, Allgemeinheit, and Einzelheit. Einzelheit is what we say, individuality, singularity, something like that. And I claim that the paradigm of that is the social institution of normativity by reciprocal recognition. That's how particular organisms, we'll see they're desiring organisms, thereon hangs a tail. Particulars institute a universal, a community, by adopting attitudes towards each other, and thereby raise themselves above mere particularity to being something new, individual self-conscious subjects. When they stand in the right recognitive relations to each other, and so become community members, not just particulars, but individuals, particulars as community members, as individual self-conscious normative subjects. So he has a story about how self-conscious normative individuality arises out of mere particularity when the relations among the particulars institute a universal, a community, a recognitive community, under which they fall in virtue of being recognized by everybody they recognize. This is the paradigm, I claim, of the relation between particularity, universality, and individuality. And one of the reasons I don't like the order of exposition he pursues in the science of logic is that drops away. He says, no, in thinking about that, I found this deeper abstract structure of particularity, universality, and individuality, which I can use to understand conceptual content generally. And I can throw away the ladder that I climbed up on to get this, the social institution of normativity. And I think you need that ladder. He's throwing away something of absolutely crucial significance there. So I want to use this notion of reciprocal recognition to understand even his logic. Now, this isn't a line that I pursue in the book. It's something you'll hear more about in my penultimate presentation, when I claim that in understanding the phenomenology, you've understood everything you need to understand the logic. Okay, so I do want to say some more about this, but let me pause here for comments or questions. Yes, Siddharth.
Thanks. So I'm curious how this theory handles cases where the normative status one is dependent on some kind of relationship with some external facts of the matter. So if you have a community which recognizes someone as, I don't know, someone with a great scientist or someone who has a substantive amount of knowledge about the world, it's both plausible in imagination and historically true that there have been many cases where some community is just systematically mistaken about the facts of the world. You know, things like astrology or alchemy are sort of prototypical examples, or we can even consider moral cases like Nazis and so on. So in those kinds of cases, if the community recognizes someone as a great scientist or a great moral saint, we would say they're just systematically mistaken about that judgment, right? So I'm curious how, if everything is constituted socially, then how do we handle those kinds of cases?
Okay, there's a good question, and there's a couple of things to say, I think. The first one is that what normative status is instituted is a matter of the authority that the people doing the recognition have and have been granted. So you can get recognized, you can get constituted as, you know, a genuine astrologer by being recognized by the astrological community. But given our lack of recognition of them, we're not going to see that as a status of, you know, genuine knower of things about the world. The meaning of that status is, you know, a product of the community that is instituting it, and their own story they tell about it isn't necessarily binding on us. Second thing I would want to say is, though Hegel doesn't here, he does, I think, a bit in the philosophy of right. He doesn't here exploit this apparatus to talk about more complex social institutions. So here he's concerned about and is addressing the most fundamental normative status, namely being a subject of normative attitudes and statuses at all, having any authority, any responsibility, being able to recognize someone as a normative subject. But if we look at sort of more specific institutional statuses, I'm committed to recognizing as the US British ambassador whoever is recognized in a different sense as that by first the president who appoints him, and second by the Senate who ratifies him. Those are different senses of recognition, but if the ones I recognize as president and as Senate in those different senses recognize in these different senses someone as an ambassador, then I'm obliged to recognize that as the ambassador. This is what I call relations of specific recognition, not attributing the general constitutive underlying status of being in the normative game at all, but having these more specific normative statuses. Hegel is still going to say they're all instituted by recognition, but the recognition can have a much more complicated structure than this egalitarian equivalence relation, which he still will insist that's what it is to be in the game at all. But after that, we can build on that normative statuses that don't have that structure. Third thing I want to say is, if the underlying structure, though, doesn't have that egalitarian structure of reciprocal recognition, then he thinks it's metaphysically defective, and that manifests itself in practical and theoretical defects of it that we can see. And that's what the discussion of lordship and bondage is allegorical for, that we're going to go on to look at. Okay. I think it's worth thinking a little bit about the structure of authority and responsibility in reciprocal recognition. And here we can think about a specific status. I think I used the example of the chess player when I talked about this before. Look, it's supposed to be entirely up to me who I recognize. I have the authority to recognize some people, not recognize others. But then it's not up to me whether I'm recognized in turn by those I recognize. That's a matter of their attitudes, not of mine. I mean, I can try and do things to earn it or deserve it or whatever, but I can't just make it happen by taking it so, as I can recognize someone. That's the authority of the recognized candidate recognizer. I'm responsible for my status to the one I recognize. So I want to commit myself to something. Hegel is saying, for there to be any determinateness to that commitment, it can't just be that whatever seems right to me is, that my attitude settles what I'm responsible for and whether I've fulfilled the responsibility. For it to be a determinately contentful responsibility, there has to be something that is not in my authority that determines what I've bound myself by. Otherwise, I haven't bound myself. If whatever I take to fulfill the responsibility does, then there isn't really any responsibility. I haven't genuinely bound myself. And what can do that? I've got to authorize somebody to hold me responsible for it, if there's to be a real, determinately contentful responsibility there. And what I'm responsible for is as much up to them as it is up to me. That's the picture. Only both of us can institute this status of my being responsible, being committed, with a determinately contentful responsibility or commitment. So it takes both of us to do it. That's a condition of the determinateness of the content, that there be somebody who I've authorized to hold me responsible. Okay. Look, before the break, I just want to put on the table this second model, the interpretation of what Hegel could be going on about in saying given this picture of self-consciousness as a normative, therefore social achievement, that self-consciousness is desire, which he says in 174. And I understand this as filling in the picture of us raising ourselves from merely biological beings to beings who can bind ourselves by norms, normative beings. So, okay, we can do that by adopting practical attitudes towards each other. Well, here's a model, I want to say. And I should say, I seem to be the only human being who thinks what I'm saying here is relevant to Hegel. Pippin is closer to this, but understands the desire as essentially erotic, whereas I think of it as orectic. That's the more general notion of desire that Aristotle uses. McDowell at this point turns away in disgust. He says the whole of chapter 8 of A Spirit of Trust is a paradigm example of text-free interpretation. And there is no greater sin for my colleague. And it's a fair cop. There's very little to base this on. The discussion of the organic here and in the observing reason chapter. There's a paragraph in the preface. The most I can say about this is that I think it uses raw materials that Hegel gives us to say things that I at least find illuminating about how we could think of this transformation, of this transition from desiring organisms to recognizing normative subjects. And here in the passage in the preface, he says, animals are much wiser than we. We had to go through the Eleusinian mysteries in order to understand our relation to objects of desire, whereas a desiring animal merely confronts an object and falls to without further ado and eats it up. And this, he said, showed a kind of immediate wisdom that was hard won by us. And I see him in his discussion of desire in organisms as invoking a triadic structure. Paradigm is a desire like hunger. It involves a characteristic activity that it triggers, that expresses the hunger. That's eating. And a characteristic significance that objects can have relative to the desire. If as hungry, I respond to something by eating it, I'm treating it as food. So I'm thinking of desire as involving this triadic structure of an attitude that motivates an activity, responding to an object by engaging in that activity, attributes a certain significance to it. I am taking or treating it as food if I eat it. That's what it is for me. It's food if I'm eating it. But there's also an objective fact of the matter. Well, objective. There's a fact of the matter beyond my attitude. And that's whether it actually satisfies my hunger. If it doesn't, if it's disgusting, inedible, or merely non-nourishing, then I have a prototype of the experience of error. It was not in itself what it was for me. I treated it as food, but it wasn't really food. And my desire was the proto-normative standard for that. It was the standard that determined whether my attitude corresponded to the actual status of this thing. My desire serves as a standard for distinguishing between what things are in themselves. Is it food in itself, really food, or is it merely apparent food, something that was just a virtual object of my attitude? I treated it as food by falling to without further ado and eating it up. So we can see how merely desiring beings could have an or version of the experience of error, of something having that change of status that he talked about as the emergence of the second new true object. I took it to be food. It had the status for me of food, but it turned out that was merely an appearance. That was merely what it was for me, not what it really was, because it didn't satisfy my hunger. It wasn't really food. And I actually think that this model, anyway, is worth putting in the context of the history of pragmatism in the 20th century. Here's a lightning dash through that. In the person of Donald Davidson. So Davidson says he was taught traditional pragmatism by his teacher, C.I. Lewis at Harvard. Basic idea, what joined Peirce and James was the thought that you can see what somebody believes by looking at what they do. So you can see that I believe it's raining if I'm opening my umbrella or I'm stepping under the awning. And so that we could functionally define belief in terms of the behavior, the actions that it made appropriate. And there could be lots of them, depending on collateral circumstances, but think of the belief that it's raining in terms of its role in producing these behaviors. But Davidson, who was moonlighting in the psychology laboratories in the early 50s at Harvard, says, that's not right. He's leaving out the desires. Sure, if I desire to stay dry, then my belief that it's raining will, have me opening the umbrella or stepping under the awning. But if I have the Gene Kelly desire to sing and dance in the rain, my believing that it's raining is going to be leading to Gene Kelly behavior, not to opening umbrellas and standing under awnings. Really, we have to think about beliefs and desires as functioning in producing actions. And Davidson's characteristic philosophy that he began to articulate in the mid-60s comes about when he realizes that it's not just that the traditional pragmatists were wrong in having a one-factor account, it's just beliefs and actions. Really, we need the two-factor beliefs and desires and actions. No, really, we need a three-factor account because the behavior that we care about is in no small part discursive behavior. It's making noises to each other. And what beliefs and desires a given action manifests depends on what those utterances mean. So in fact, we have to simultaneously solve for beliefs, desires, and meanings from what somebody does. Okay, well, if you think about that progression, then you can also think about how much more powerful and flexible this triadic account of desire is than the Skinnerian stimulus response two-factor picture derived from psychologists looking at operant learning, that was the behaviorist model in psychology until the rise of cognitive science in the 70s. This model that looks to the three factors, the desire, the activity, and the significance, along with which is rich enough to engender experience of error, well, how much better we would have been off if we'd been working with the triadic or rectic model of proto-consciousness instead of a simple stimulus response one. Well, what I do in chapter 8 is argue that we can understand recognition as arising from desire if we think about what you would have to do in order to attribute to something the significance of being a desirer. That is, of being something that things were something for, in the same way in which things can be food for a hungry animal. The activity would be recognition, taking them to be a taker. And the claim is that the only desire that can give things that significance is the desire for recognition. Now, it's an intricate argument. As I say, it's at a maximal distance from the text, so I'm not going to rehearse it, but I'm not above advertising it. It's there if you want to look at it. Okay. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about mastery, about lordship and bondage. But let me say beforehand, again, as a bit of advertisement, though we now know, and it seems sort of obvious, that this discussion was very important to Marx. This was not always clear. It wasn't until we got the 1844 manuscripts that we really knew this. And basically, nobody cared about this part of the book between Marx and Alexander Kojève, who's the one who taught us about lordship and bondage, and in no small part, therefore, about recognition. He gave a series of Hegel seminars, phenomenology seminars. Hegelians didn't so much read the phenomenology in those days, in the 1930s in Paris, that were attended by Merleau-Ponty, Jacques Lacan, Georges Bataille. Sartre didn't come, but Simone de Beauvoir did and tattled to him about it. And other figures like Raymond Queneau, André Breton, Raymond Aron, and Eric Weil. We actually have among us Sequoia Aoki, who is an Eric Weil specialist. They all came to these seminars. The scales fell from their eyes. This transformed the reception of Hegel in France, down to today. So, for 90 years, this has been important. Though he was educated in Berlin and Heidelberg, where he met, I guess in Berlin, his lifelong friend Leo Strauss. Kojève never held academic positions in France. He became a very senior administrator, government bureaucrat. This always puzzled people. In the 90s, when the wall came down and the KGB archives were opened up, it was discovered that he had been a colonel in the NKVD, spy for Stalin for 30 years, already was in the 30s, and his assignment was, they weren't interested in him being in the university. They wanted him in the foreign policy establishment in Paris. And so I've put on the web, but here is Alexander Kojev looking like the roue. And I want you to look at him and see the spy for Stalin, as well as the brilliant Hegel reader. Here he is a little bit younger. And here he is as a still younger man. Can you see the man who would lead these two lives, the Hegel scholar and the KGB spy in him? Anyway, an interesting figure. As I say, I put these pictures on the website for your delectation. It's more colorful than most of us professors get. Okay, I have 2:57. Why don't we come back at 10 minutes after the hour? All right. So in the second section, I want to talk about mastery. Hegel has titled this first half of the chapter on the independence and dependence of self-consciousness. And I've said that I understand independence when that term is used on the side of subjects rather than the side of objects. On the side of objects, it has a sort of alethic sense, but I understand it on the side of subjects as a way of talking about authority, and dependence as a way of talking about responsibility. One of the Hegelian slogans, which Judith Sklar used as the title of her book on the topic, is From Independence to Freedom. The notion of independence as mastery, what Hegel calls pure independence, is part of what we're supposed to get over. He thinks it's an ancient ideal that is brought to a modern peak of perfection in Kant's notion of autonomy, but that Kant mistook that for freedom, genuine freedom. Well, no surprise, it's a social achievement for Hegel. The freedom of self-consciousness is the structure of authority and responsibility that we find in a community structured by reciprocal recognition. But whether they think in terms of authority or responsibility, even though they don't typically think about it in terms of authority and responsibility, the question of what it means to go from thinking in categories of independence to thinking in categories of freedom, that's a standing interpretive issue in Hegel. And I think it's important that the master's conception, the conception we get, and a genealogy of in the Lordship and Bondage section is what he calls pure independence. And I understand the conception of pure independence as authority without an admixture of responsibility. It's pure, what it's pure of is any corresponding dependence. And freedom is going to consist of independence and dependence in a mutually supporting unity. That much Hegel says on the surface of the text. His discussion of lordship and bondage is allegorical for lessons about the necessarily reciprocal relations of authority and responsibility, and the kinds of pathologies that result if authority is not balanced by corresponding responsibility, or responsibility is not balanced by corresponding authority. In the images of the master and the slave, we get the pure authority to command, to institute responsibilities, that is, institute statuses, by the attitudes of the master, the practical attitudes he expresses in a command are thought of as instituting immediately responsibilities in the slave, and the master has no corresponding responsibilities. The slave, on the other hand, has responsibility with no corresponding authority. This is the purest form, pure independence, he says, of a picture where we don't have genuine freedom, don't have the appropriate balance of authority and responsibility. And I think Hegel means this diagnosis to extend to any hierarchical organizations where recognition is taking an asymmetric form that includes superiority and subordination, the original form of normativity, the kind that we get a genealogy of here. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that I think he's expressing a diagnosis that applies not only to masters and slaves, but to a middle manager in a modern corporation, a 20th century corporation, basically an American invention, carrying over military organization to commercial organization and making it possible to move decisively beyond the family firm as an organization. It's a striking finding of institutional engineering, management science, that where if you ask managers what the trouble is with the attitudes of their subordinates, they'll say, well, they're just not interested enough in doing and committed enough to doing the job. The job just isn't important enough to them. And that's completely at odds with what you find out. I mean, not that there is none of that. You say, well, make it a better job and maybe they'll be more interested in doing it. But it's completely at odds with what you find out if you talk to the subordinates. And in this organization, practically everybody is both. They say the problem is, I can't do my job. They won't let me. I want to do the job and I can't. And what they mean is, I don't have the authority to fulfill my responsibilities. I'm not given the wherewithal to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm committed to doing it, and they won't let me do the job. This is the problem. And that one sees particularly at the extremes of these hierarchical organizations, the deleterious effects of a concentration of authority toward the top, without corresponding responsibility, and a concentration of responsibility toward the bottom without corresponding authority. And Hegel thinks, not for psychological reasons, but for deep, but for reasons that go deep into the metaphysics of normativity, that there will be pathologies that are consonant on there being a mismatch between authority and responsibility. And that's what he's diagnosing in the allegory of the master and the slave. So the first stage of his story is what he calls the struggle unto death between two desiring beings, which may result in the death of both. That's an evolutionary dead end. But if it doesn't, and results in the subjugation of one, that's the institution of the very first form of normativity, the master-slave relationship, normativity in the form of subordination and obedience, what is projected ontologically into the great chain of being that has God at the top, kings, and so on, all the way down to the inanimate at the bottom, construed as a normative order with the right to command above and the duty to obey below. Now, this picture of the cavemen Ugg and Og struggling over who's to be the master is faintly comic, certainly melodramatic. It's an allegory. We need to read it. He tells us that what we see is that the one who comes out of the struggle as the master would rather die than submit. And the one who comes out as the servant, the slave, Herr und Knecht are Hegel's terms, is the one who would rather submit than die. What's going on there? Well, I think the key passage is in 187. He says, "It's only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as vanishing moments, that it is only pure being for self." But both of the desiring beings have got attitudes. Things are something for them. What the one who becomes the master shows is that he identifies with some of his attitudes. His attitudes, what he is for himself, is essential to what he is in himself. He makes that so. And in making what he is for himself essential to what he is in himself, he makes himself into a new kind of being, an essentially self-conscious being, by which I just mean someone for whom what they are for themselves is essential and not just accidental to what they are in themselves. What is it for one of your attitudes to be essential to what you are in yourself, rather than just your biological being essential to what you are in yourself? That is, what is it to be essentially a normative self-conscious being and not just a biological desiring organism? Well, you have to identify with your attitudes rather than with your biological being. And I think that notion of identifying with an attitude is a matter of practically being willing to sacrifice for it. The difference between what's more and less essential is, well, when there's a forced choice between them, which do you pick? It's a struggle unto death because the one who becomes the master would rather die than give up his self-conception, his conception of his desires as being sovereign, pure independence. And if he dies over that, okay, he's that risk, that sacrifice he's willing to make. The one who becomes the slave, the servant, the connect, is not, in the end, identifies with his biological life. It's only through staking your life that freedom is won. If there isn't some commitment, some normative status that you would risk your biological life for, you really are, at base, a biological organism and not a normative being. In some of the more hair-raising things that Hegel says, for instance, in the Philosophy of Right, about war, are consequences of this view of his, that to be a genuinely human being, you have to be willing to risk your biological life for something in the normative realm, for some commitment, some responsibility, some authority, something normative and not merely biological. I find helpful here thinking about the Japanese warrior code of Bushido that the samurai lived by, which required ritual suicide under a daunting variety of circumstances. If you were unable to carry out your Lord's commands, you had to kill yourself. And surely even very committed samurai must have sort of hoped they wouldn't have the bad moral luck of getting into the situation where that would happen. But if it did, then you had the choice of whether to do what you were normatively obliged to do, what you were committed to do, commit harikiri, seppuku, kill yourself, or not. And if you didn't, then you showed that you were not a samurai, and indeed had never been a samurai, but only an animal who pretended to be one. To be the samurai, essentially to have that normative status of the samurai, required risking and, if need be, sacrificing your life for that status. That's a very pure form of the commitment, the kind of commitment that is identification with yourself as a normative being, as the subject of normative statuses and attitudes, and not merely as a desiring organism. The one who is the master shows that he identifies with himself as a normative being, in the sense that he's willing to risk and, if need be, sacrifice his biological life. That's more important to him. And in doing that, he actually transforms the kind of being he is. By making that choice, by identifying through willingness to sacrifice something he already is in himself, a living organism. For something he is for himself, a normative being, someone who has authority, he actually lifts himself up, constitutes himself as as essentially normative being. Now, in doing that, he actually acquires the authority to constitute the slave as also a normative being, but of an inferior subordinate kind, one who has only responsibilities and no authority. But the master has constituted himself as someone who can constitutively recognize someone as that kind of normative being. So here, there's both theoretical and practical self-consciousness involved. Theoretical self-consciousness at the most basic level is being a self for yourself. And Hegel's insight here is, well, you got to have the concept of a self. Got to recognize some people as selves in order to be able to recognize yourself as one. But the master takes himself to be, recognizes himself to be a normative being by identifying unto death, being willing to risk and if need be sacrifice life for that status, makes himself into a normative being. And if he weren't willing to do that, there would be no normative beings. This is the origins of normativity, even though it's in a form that is distorted by the power relations of superiority and by the power relations between the master and the slave that are expressed normatively as statuses of superiority and subordination. But there's also a kind of practical self-consciousness, which is in practice taking yourself to be a self. That's identifying with yourself as a status of normative being, as the subject of normative statuses and attitudes, as being able to commit yourself, having that authority. Now, Hegel thinks that there's a metaphysical irony built into this asymmetric recognitive structure. In an earlier writing from a couple of years earlier, he sketches what will become this argument and calls it the paradox of fate. But metaphysical irony of mastery is here that the self, the self-conception that the master identifies with unto death is of himself as purely independent, as authoritative with no admixture of responsibility. Responsibility is outsourced. And he can only have that conception given the recalcitrance of objects to desire, because the slave is going to grow or catch, cook, prepare, and serve his food, satisfy his desires without the master needing to have the experience of error. That's the conception he identifies with, and nobody can be that. That's not a coherent conception So there's a mismatch, in fact, between what the master is in himself and what he is for himself. He can't be in himself what he is for himself. But I don't think people reading this, have appreciated the extent to which the master was right. I mean, he did perform this transformative act of self-constitution. He made himself into an essentially normative being by being willing to risk his life for his commitment to this defective self-conception. He's right that he had a constitutive ability, that his practical attitude of identification with a commitment rather than with his biological self altered his status. He was right about that. There is a constitutive act, a status that he instituted by adopting that practical attitude. It isn't the status he thought he instituted. He thought he'd instituted himself as purely independent. And he didn't, because you can't. But that wasn't just a stupid mistake on his part, because he had instituted a status just by taking him, made himself into something just by adopting an attitude. It's just that the object of his attitude, a purely independent subject, that's the virtual object of his attitude, what he was committed to unto death, isn't the same as the status that he actually instituted. But he did institute the status of being an essentially normative being. So it's an intelligible mistake. He overgeneralized. His attitudes were not transparently constitutive, in that though he could make himself in himself something different than he had been by his practical attitude of identification and sacrifice, he didn't have the power to make himself into whatever he was for himself. He couldn't make himself be in himself that. So he immediately instituted a status, a genuinely normative status, by adopting an attitude, but that status falls short of the sovereignty, the practical pure independence that he identifies with. So there's a cognitive mistake that he made. But the fundamental mistake he made is a recognitive mistake. And this is where the irony comes in and the causality of fate, where the fact that your attitudes don't properly reflect the metaphysical structure of normativity revenges itself on you. Because though the master constitutes himself as, in some sense, the master, and the slave is, in some sense, the slave, anyway, he institutes normative statuses, genuinely normative statuses. And it's the case that what the master is, what the master and the slave are for the master and the slave, at least in Hegel's allegory, is what the master and the slave are for the slave, too. The slave takes the master to be the master, to have authority without responsibility, and understands himself as the slave to have responsibility without authority. But not only are they both cognitively wrong, there's a misrecognition where recognition is what's instituting these normative statuses. And that is, although the master takes the slave to have no authority at all, the master is the master only insofar as he's recognized as such by the slave. In fact, the master's status is as dependent on its recognition by the slave as it is of the master's commitment to it unto death, which instituted it. It's a genuinely normative status and so a genuinely social status. In fact, the master is dependent, indeed totally dependent, on the slave, responsible recognitively to the slave's acknowledgement of his normative status to have it. He can kill the slave. That's why the slave is a slave. But it's the normative attitude that the slave adopts rather than be killed that makes him the master. So recognitively, his normative status is as much a product of the slave's attitudes as it is of his. That's the metaphysical irony of the sort of selfhood that the master institutes. That's the avenging causality of fate. And I think I mentioned in my quick sketch of this in the second session, a psychological reflection of this sort of situation, which, though Hegel is talking about the metaphysical structure of normativity that's socially instituted here, but it has psychological reflections. I emphasize this because, as we'll see, alienation is a feature of the structure of the metaphysics of normativity, even though, and it has psychological consequences. Hegel's using it that term alienation in an umphier metaphysical sense than the watered down, merely psychological sense, I would say, that that term has come to have in our own time. We can see this already. But for a psychological reflection of this, think about the celebrity, maybe in entertainment or politics, who revels in a feeling of superiority over ordinary, non-celebrated people. That's the status that they take themselves to have. And it's understood as, they're being recognized as celebrities is both epistemically and witnessing or testifying to that superiority. They identify with that status. They will sacrifice for it. They probably have sacrificed for it. They take that superior, distinguished status as a VIP to be essential to what and who they really are in themselves. It's the basis of their self-esteem, articulating what they are for themselves. And they despise the mass of inferior, non-celebrated, undistinguished, talentless, ordinary people, by contrast to whom their own status is defined. An integral part of the status the celebrity identifies with is the right to distinguish asymmetrically, to look down on those with lesser status. But the metaphysical irony, the causality of fate, is that they are who they are only because they're recognized as such by the people they despise. It's the attitudes, the recognition of those despised inferior masses that makes them celebrities in the first place. It's their recognition that institutes this status. So they're in the unstable position of being who they are because they're recognized as being that by people whose opinions they accord no authority and for which they have no respect. And that's not a stable basis for self-respect. I mean, I at least find that psychological correlate of the sort of criticism that he's or diagnosis that he's making here telling. So let me pause there a little bit for questions or comments. Yeah, Paolo, you're muted.
Isn't there a sense in which consciousness was in itself what it was for itself in sense certainty, perception, and force understanding? Is there a way this analogy kind of looks back on that?
I mean, each of them was out of step, I think is what one wants to say, because the development from sense certainty to perception is discovering that empirical consciousness cannot be in itself what it is for sense certainty. Sense certainty doesn't think concepts are involved and doesn't think that recollection is involved. And it becomes clear for us, looking over the phenomenological consciousness, looking over its shoulder, that there's this disparity between what it is in itself and what it is for itself. And that leads us to consider another more developed self-consciousness that has taken into what it is for itself some of the lessons that we learned about what even sense certainty was already in itself. So yeah, I think we're supposed to look back and understand the development from sense certainty to perception to understanding as progressive in the sense that the later forms have more of what they really are in themselves as part of what they are for themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, Natalie.
When you were first laying out how the master and slave come to be, I think you said something to the effect that the slave becomes a normative being when the master recognizes the slave as a slave. Would that be sort of acknowledging and very baseline authority? And is that how this messy metaphysics comes into play?
Yeah, absolutely. The master institutes recognitive relations that make him the master and the slave the slave. And though it's not part of his self-conception, he's made the slave into a genuinely normative being, every bit as much as he's made the master into a genuinely normative being. It's their recognitive relation that gets established. So, his recognition of the slave as a slave is every bit as constitutive of the relation as the slave's recognition of the master as a master. It's just the master can only see the first half of that. His role is constitutive. And where this is going in Hegel's text, the final turn of the crank on the metaphysical irony is that because the master has a completely immediate relation to his own desires, he expresses the desire, and now it's somebody else's job to overcome the recalcitrance of the objective world and satisfy his desire. it's just desire and satisfaction for him, whereas the slave is obliged to labor to concretely go through the experience of error and failure and become genuinely powerful in dealing with the actual world, that Hegel says the master is an evolutionary dead end, a dead end in the evolution of self-conscious humanity. The subject of all the rest of human development is the slave. That's the only way forward from this situation. And so the master has not only instituted the slave as a normative being and made himself normatively responsible to the slave's recognition for him being the master, but has instituted the slave as his successor, as the way forward, leaving the master behind in the dust of history, at least of history recollected and reconstructed in an expressively progressive way. There could be masters and slaves forever, but the way forward for humanity has the slaves as the subject, not the masters. They're the only ones who can get to the next level of normativity and self-consciousness.
Thanks.
And apropos of that, it's that realization at the end of part A of the chapter that turns our attention as the phenomenological consciousness to the intentional agency that's exercised in the labor of the slave. We say, well, that's what we've got to understand. So we'll turn our attention to intentional agency in the reason chapter. Maybe I should say about the Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. Those are forms of slave consciousness, progressive forms that retreat to save the ideal, to try and save the ideal, actualize the ideal of pure independence, of authority without correlative responsibility, by retreating to the realm of thought. The skeptic who can reject any commitment by finding a countervailing incompatible commitment with equally good epistemic credentials, the Stoic who refuses to acknowledge that anything objectively can constrain him because everything depends on how he interprets it. You can hurt him, but you can't make him care that you hurt him, make him act differently because you hurt him. He has complete freedom to interpret. That's the Stoic idea. The unhappy consciousness, the divided consciousness, is the medieval Christian consciousness in the allegory, and that's a more complicated story. But about each of these forms of retreat into thought or the otherworldly, the lesson that we're to learn from them is that if they were the kind of being they say they are, they couldn't have determinate thoughts or intentions. That it's only by engaging with the cycle of perception and action that essentially involves error and failure that the determinate contentfulness of their thoughts and intentions is intelligible. So that's all exactly what he should be arguing from the point of view of my semantic reading of this. But it's a bit of an aside in the progression of the book, which, as I say, we get the full rationale for the expository transition to reason already at the end of part A, which may be why part B is sort of an appendix to the three-part A where all the action is.
Sorry, can I
Please.
ask a question? I was just wanted to ask if you might be able to clarify something. It might be that perhaps I missed something, but I was wondering, so why is it the capacity to stake our biological self for some non-biological commitment that makes us essentially normative, rather than, for example, the self-interested desire to be conceived as a trustworthy and reliable subject by others? One might think that that already provides the basis for normativity.
Okay. I think Hegel's view is that the willingness to risk and, if need be, sacrifice your biological life for your commitments, for your normative statuses and attitudes, is a rock bottom, unget-overable condition of being a genuine normative subject, that you're sort of faking it if there isn't anything like that. But this melodramatic story about the struggle unto death of Ugg and Og is an allegory. And once we're born into already up and running recognitive communities, most of what we are in ourselves that we have to sacrifice for something we are for ourselves to show what we really are is already normative. It's the willingness to risk your job for some element of your self-conception. Well, the job, that's a normative status that you have, and if you're willing to risk and, if need be, sacrifice that, rather than no longer be entitled to think of yourself as trustworthy or having some other virtue, that's showing that that commitment really is an essential feature of who you are in yourself, that being that for yourself really is part of what you are in yourself. And most of the action is now not with risk of life. Again, I say these things about war. He thinks that's where it comes out, whether you're really a member of your recognitive community or sort of like the lily-livered samurai who, if it comes up, isn't going to do it. If you're not willing to risk your life for the community in the end, you're not, in the full sense, a member of that community. But most of what we really are is a matter of identifying with one normative status or attitude rather than another, rather than identifying with the normative status, rather than with ourselves as merely biological beings. So he thinks if you want to know who somebody really is, see which of their attitudes they're willing to risk or sacrifice for which other ones. That's what they identify with. And that doesn't automatically make them in themselves what they are for themselves, but it makes that attitude an essential element of what they are for themselves. And that's to be an essentially self-conscious being. So the kind of thing you're talking about, yeah, that's mostly what we're engaged with. But behind it, he thinks, is always this rock bottom possibility. Yeah, Sequoia?
So I think I agree with you largely in the fact that this is a historically and maybe logically it's an allegorical story. However, do you think that Hegel would accept that there is a sense in which in our own personal development, there is an element of our personal development that goes through these kind of recognitional conflicts? I'm thinking specifically like being a little kid on the school ground, right? Where kids are bullied or kids are like trying to find their own like way. There does seem to be some element of that that's there where like whoever is the most willing to pick on some other kid gets recognized as like truly the master of the schoolyard, and the other kids aren't seen, right? I don't know if this is right, but.
Well, no, surely it is. And, you know, we're not at the utopia where there's no subordination and superiority. And if that stopped happening to you back since schoolyard days, you're fortunate indeed, Sequoia, because the bullying of subordinates by superiors is a unget-overable feature of life still. Hegel is giving us the conceptual tools to diagnose pathologies of it, but actually instituting recognitive communities that have the egalitarian structure of reciprocal recognition, that's a practical institutional task, and we ain't there yet. Okay. So, the picture we end up with is that there's something defective and so pathological about normativity that takes the asymmetric form of subordination and obedience, rather than the form of freedom, the balancing of authority and responsibility that we see in proper reciprocal recognitive relations, where it's up to me who I recognize, who I take to have the authority, who I grant the authority to hold me responsible. But then I have granted them that authority and I am responsible to them. That structure is bent out of shape by underlying power relations that produce these hierarchical, non-egalitarian normative structures. And that doesn't go away with the advent of modernity, he thinks. I said, Kantian autonomy is still an ideal of mastery, now self-mastery. And we actually see a later version of that in Nietzsche, of that Kantian idea of mastery in the form of self-mastery. The rest of the book is going to be an exploration of life with genuine normativity, but deformed by the underlying asymmetric power relations. And as I read it, the book culminates in a vision of the promised land, of what the final adequate form of reciprocal recognition will be. His allegory for that is a structure where recognition takes the form of confession and forgiveness, reciprocal confession, reciprocal forgiveness. That's the structure I call trust, following a remark he makes. He doesn't officially call this trust. So that's where we're going in the long run. For next week, we're going to look at the treatment of intentional agency. I came into this story really when reading the Reason chapter, I found the answer to some questions I'd had about Davidson's theory of agency that I couldn't work my way through. And when I saw Hegel's account of it, I said, okay, this is what we need to move on beyond Davidson. And so I think Hegel had a theory of agency that is as sophisticated as anything we've got still today. And in any case, that this is the core of the book, because we move on from here to considering the stages of Geist, having learned about empirical consciousness, normativity, community, and self-consciousness, and then about practical agency. Then we pull them together and look historically. So that's where we're going. And I will see you next time.